All
John
right.
Shea, welcome to the Baseball Bookshelf.
Well, thank you.
So, new book about Willie Mays. The first question I always ask when there have been multiple books about a player is why this book and why now?
Ooh. Well, Willie Mays is 89 years old. Why this book? Well, I guess you either can't read enough about Willie Mays or there hasn't been written what this book is before. And what this book is not only a glance into his career, but his life based on what he's thinking now, based on what others are thinking now. I spent 100 plus hours with Willie and did more than 200 interviews for the purpose of this book. And I brought all these interviews back to Willie, and I'm talking Negro League teammates and Hall of Famers and everybody out of the game that would know him or know of him or intimately know him. And I just think that this book, unlike any other Willie book, it talks about the here and now rather than using Willie's quotes from 1951 or 1954 or whatever. So this book has no bibliography. This book has no quotes that were used in any other publication. So it's 100% new, exclusive, fresh stuff. And of course, Willie dominates the pages with his input on his big games, his big moments, his relationships with Aaron and Mantle and Barack Obama and key people from his dad to Monty Irvin and Leo DeRocher, who were there when he showed up in 1951. So it's comprehensive in that it's new information on stories you might already know, but this is a lot more than just the stories you know.
One of the things I really appreciated about this book was it's kind of a throwback. It's none of the, he's very respectful, he's very generous. There's no telling tales about players, his relationships with, like you say, Aaron and Mantle and Duke Snider, who was a third member of the New York center field triumvirate, are amazingly kind and gentle. And for someone of my age who has been reading about baseball since childhood, that's what the books all used to be like when I was a kid. And then, of course, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Ball 4 this year. That's when things changed. And this is like a throwback to that.
An interesting way of looking at it. And it's not as if I went in or we went in saying, we're going to stay away from that. It's just that 200 plus interviews never came up. I mean, here's a guy who, you could write about Mickey Mantle and all his carousing and drinking, and DiMaggio with his thing, and pretty much one in the past. But with Mays, who didn't smoke, didn't drink, and didn't get thrown out of games, or didn't start fights, or didn't charge the mound, and lived an exemplary life by all accounts from all the folks I spoke with, hey, shoot, Willie Mays is an American hero. He's not just a baseball or sports hero. He's a cultural icon, and he did things the right way. So Willie never told me, don't write this or don't write that. And, it's co-authored, but at the same time, I guess you could say, on the other hand, Jackie Robinson was critical of him, and that's something that surfaced in the book, that many players who looked up to Willie and followed him during the 60s and 70s kind of shot down as something Jackie wrote that Willie didn't do enough for the African-American cause. And, I just wondered about that. I always thought that was true, and I looked into it and asked Reggie Jackson and Maury Wills and Hank Aaron and Frank Robinson, Joe Morgan, and all these people had examples on why he was instrumental for them, doing things his way, not Jackie's way. He was behind the scenes, he led by examples, and Jackie obviously reached the major leagues in his late 20s after playing in the Negro League, serving in the military, going to UCLA, marrying Rachel. And Willie came up at age 20, and his dad said, "Cool it, be quiet, don't do those things." And for the longest time he didn't. So he opens up quite a bit on race, unlike in any other uh, chronicled version of his life.
One of the things that struck me as you talk about that was his difficulty in obtaining a house in San Francisco because while he was a major celebrity there, people didn't want him living next door.
Well, imagine that, liberal and upbeat and San Francisco progressive way of doing things, right? Well, no, this was 1957, December, right before the Giants were going to open in San Francisco for the first time the following April. And the man couldn't even buy a house in a white neighborhood. He was turned down, and the newspapers made a big deal out of it. It became a national story and a big embarrassment to San Francisco and Mayor Christopher, who orchestrated the move from New York to San Francisco. Now here, the best player on the team, the best player in the game, can't even buy a house in the city that he now plays in. It was ridiculous. It turned into a one-day story. Willie got his way. He fought through it. He said, "No, I'm getting this house." But it was a one-day story in that he got the house the next day after fighting it. And more than that, he got the house, for the next family, the next minority who might want to come in and buy in that neighborhood. So it wasn't just about him. He was looking ahead to the next folks who wanted to buy in so they wouldn't have the trouble that Willie did. Now, if you're not Willie Mays, you wouldn't have made it a one-day story. You would have just gotten rejected and gone about your way. That's the way it was. But Willie put an end to that and integrated the neighborhood, and it's still one of the premier neighborhoods in the city. But what he did at that time was amazing when you think about it now, because the Giants play at 24 Willie Mays Plaza, and they have a big statue of Willie Mays out front, and the right field wall is 24 feet high, and it's all about Willie Mays. And you couldn't imagine early on that he wasn't appreciated enough to allow him to live in the place he wanted to live. He did, after all. But more than that, he wasn't even received so well in those early years in San Francisco because this was Joe DiMaggio's territory. Remember, Joe played on the old San Francisco Seals in the old Pacific Coast League. And this was his town, and Willie played his position, and Willie played at his ballpark, Seal Stadium, for a couple of years before they moved to Candlestick. So it's just it's so incredible to see, and that's how the book leads off, is Willie is playing in Joe DiMaggio's shadow, even though DiMaggio was long gone.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. You said this is the first year the Giants were playing there. I think I've read in previous books about the Giants and Willie Mays that he wasn't accepted as willingly because he was a New York hero. And when the Giants moved there, they wanted their own heroes, which is why people like Orlando Cepeda and Willie McCovey became favorites of the San Francisco Giants. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely true. Cepeda was the Rookie of the Year in '58. McCovey was the Rookie of the Year in '59. They had their own guys. They had their own superstars. And who's this Mays guy who is all about New York and won the hearts over in Ebbets Field and Yankee Stadium, the Polo Grounds, whatever. And now he's coming to our place, and we have the tale of Joe DiMaggio, but we also have these young San Francisco stars. But I spoke with a bunch of old timers, some teammates, like Joe Morgan grew up in the East Bay, and his dad used to take him to Seal Stadium. And he looks back at that and says it was kind of media driven. There was some booze, yeah, but those are old timers from maybe North Beach who just wouldn't let DiMaggio go. Some people in the media wanted to make a bigger deal than it actually was, but there was something there, obviously. If Willie Mays isn't fully and totally accepted on day one, there are issues. And maybe not until 1962, when the Giants reached the World Series for the first time in San Francisco, and Willie had such a key contribution late in that season with a home run in the 162nd game that helped force a tie with the Dodgers and create a best-of-3 playoff with the Dodgers, and the winner would win the pennant and go to the World Series. Well, Mays hit 2 home runs in that best-of-3, one off Koufax, and got a key hit in the third game, the winning rally that put the Giants ahead to win the pennant. So anyway, maybe not until then was he fully appreciated by folks in the media and old timers who, preferred DiMaggio. So it just was crazy because Willie had just great year after great year after great year. What else could he have done? And obviously, I imagine race was a factor. DiMaggio was white, Willie was black, and even in San Francisco, as we know, when he tried to buy a house, it wasn't easy. And the Giants had the most diverse clubhouse in those early 60s, with the three Alou brothers and Cepeda and Marichal and Jose Pagan and Willie and McCovey and Mays. And it's quite a list. And it's a wonderful list of great ball players. But the Giants were maybe before their time, and for some people, unfortunately, they were slow to adjust.
Oh, one of the things that strikes me as funny is the choice of manager in those years, Alvin Dark, who seemed to have some trouble dealing with the Latin American players.
It was unbelievable. Yeah, he was a manager for a few years. He was Willie's teammate in New York. He was the shortstop on the team that won the 54 series. And years later, now he's the San Francisco manager, and he makes Willie the first African-American captain in baseball history. So both those gentlemen from the South, they understood each other, but for some reason, Dark didn't want Latin players speaking Spanish in the clubhouse. And imagine that. Three Alou brothers, Cepeda, Marichal, all these proud folks who grew up speaking Spanish, and English is a second language, and he wants them, once they leave the parking lot, to only speak English. It was ridiculous. But Orlando Cepeda said Alvin Dark cost the Giants pennants. They only won one in the 60s, and they had the best record in the 60s. Juan Marichal had the most wins in the 60s. They had all these Hall of Famers, but they always finished second. 5 straight years they finished second. And the 60s had wonderful teams, St. Louis and the Dodgers. I mean, even the Cubs, who finished last often, just had a bunch of Hall of Famers, and they were a very good team. So it was rough playing for Alvin, but thanks to Mays, there wasn't a mutiny. In 1964, a columnist from New York, Stan Isaacs, wrote a story on Alvin Dark and quoted him by saying all these terrible things about minorities. And Alvin told me until the day he died, he didn't say those things. But Felipe told me, listen, I've heard him say enough things that even though he said he didn't say those things, I wouldn't have been surprised if he did say those things. So a diverse clubhouse, yes, but a divided clubhouse. And only Mays prevented a mutiny, because all these minority players were just going to walk out on Alvin and say, that's it, you need another manager. And it was Willie who brought all these teammates together in the hotel in Pittsburgh and said, don't let him win. Don't let the bigots win. Play for yourself, play for each other, play for the team. And that's what they did from that day on. And Alvin Dark was fired after the season, but a good story in the end, because Alvin, at an old timers game years and years later, went around the room in the hotel they were all staying and apologized to Jose Pagan, apologized to Orlando Cepeda, apologized to Felipe Alou, and they all forgave him, and their families became tight. And it's a good ending, because as Orlando told me, he didn't want that in his heart when he died. And so, but in the early 60s, it was pretty rough on the Latin players for the San Francisco Giants.
Now, this book follows basically a chronological progression. Willie as a child, growing up in the South, coming up through the Negro Leagues, coming up through the minor leagues. One of the chapters that stood out for me was the one that kind of talks about his statistics in modern terms with the new analytics. And I don't think there's any solid fan of baseball who needs any kind of rationalization that Willie Mays was one of, if not the greatest players of all time. So I think that was like a nod to modern fans to show you, yeah, this is what he did, and this is why he deserves the accolades that he had. I want to talk a little bit about way the book is done. Willie's quotes are in boldface. At least I'm talking about. I have the advanced reader copy, so I'm guessing it's the same in the
Yeah.
final product. So his thoughts are in boldface, and you extrapolate on them very well and in great detail throughout. So talk about how you work together on that.
Yeah, it's a format that I've never seen in another book. I don't know about you, but you're right. It's Willie and boldface. It's not Mays said or Willie said or said Willie or anything like that. It's given that he interjects in every story with his words. And when I first spoke with Willie 15 years ago about a book project, he said, I would like to see this book in classrooms, and thus the inspirational theme, thus life stories and life lessons from the Say Hey Kid. And each chapter starts with a Willie Mays lesson of 1 or 2 or 3 sentences. And, you know, the storytelling that follows sort of backs up the lesson provided by Willie to begin each chapter.
And how
So,
many chapters are there?
24?
Gee, is that a coincidence?
No, that was that it all came together. I mean, we didn't know that when we first started, but when we came across the title, and my good friend Kurt Aguilar, who was my chief right-hand man and editor, former San Francisco Chronicle, San Jose Mercury copy editor, and Willie Mays and baseball historian, looked after every word before it was sent into the publisher, and then looked at him again and again and again. He came up with 24. And I said, of course, 24. Bingo, you're a genius. 24 chapters, 24 lessons. And you remember the movie on Jackie Robinson was 42. This is the opposite, 24. But it's such an iconic number. You know, Ricky Henderson was 24 because of Willie Mays. Ken Griffey Jr. was 24 because of Ricky Henderson. Rick Barry, the basketball player who grew up in New Jersey idolizing Mays at the Polo Grounds, became 24 as in the NBA. And then he was traded to Houston from the Warriors, by the way, and he became 2 at home and 4 on the road because Moses Malone was 24 and he couldn't get that number in his final 2 years. So there's a lot of guys who, and like Joe Morgan, who played with Griffey's dad in Cincinnati and played with Tony Perez in Cincinnati, who was 24. Joe Morgan says in the book, he says, there's only one 24 in my mind, and that's Willie Mays. So yeah, we spent a lot of time on how we were going to present it, but I think it worked from what everybody tells us. Willie on pretty much every page, but everyone else's words complementing his or supplementing his. And every time I got an interview, I brought it back to Willie, and you know, he maybe rang a bell or whatever, and he reminisced on that particular event or time in his life and career, and we just ran with it that way. So all kinds of different chapters. You said it's a chronology. In an extent it is, but in an extent it's not, because yes, the father chapter is early on, the Negro League chapter is early on, and breaking into the Giants, and then from there it goes into his big games. And there's a 5-tool chapter in which he talks first person in the entire chapter, almost a how-to for kids or whomever on how he ran, how he threw, how he fielded, how he hit for power. And another tool on the 6th chapter, the mental game. And then all the relationships. Relationship with Obama is a chapter. Relationship with Hank is a chapter. With Mickey and the Duke, a chapter. So it's a good thing his number wasn't 3, because that would only be 3.
A short book.
Barrio's number 75. I don't know if we could have gotten that far, but 24 is just perfect.
Now, you say you were, how long have you been working on this book? You've mentioned 15 years. How long was this book in the process?
I would say that. I mean, even though Willie said, yeah, I'd like to do it, it didn't really reach fruition maybe till about 4 years ago. But in the meantime, I spoke with him about it. I spoke with all the people I could, including, we were just speaking of Alvin Dark. I spent many hours with him talking about race, talking about his career, Jackie Robinson, all the wonderful things he accomplished on the field, but also the controversy that surrounded him. but I also spoke with a lot of people who aren't with us anymore, and it gave me an opportunity to do all this research because we had time. There wasn't a rush, and luckily there wasn't, because I didn't want this to be an overnight book or a hurry up book or anything like that. It needed to be comprehensive and complete. And in fact, toward the end, I spoke with Hank Aaron. Toward the end, I spoke with George W. Bush, but much earlier, I spoke with Bill Clinton. So I kind of wanted both presidents. I want to be right down the aisle, right? And both of those guys grew up big Willie Mays fans. Grew up in the South, the first baby boomer presidents, and George Bush, his first game in his life was at the Polo Grounds, and that was his introduction to Willie Mays. And Bill Clinton, when he was 10, his parents bought a black and white TV for him, and one of the first things he saw on TV was Willie Mays on his screen. And for those images, these two presidents tell me that was the start of a love affair with the man. And then they became presidents and invited him to the White House, and they became buddies. Willie and President Clinton, Willie and President Bush, and Willie knew Bush's dad. And Willie got a real close relationship with Obama for obvious reasons. I mean, Willie knew Barack when Barack Obama was a senator, and they kind of became friends. There's this great picture of Willie signing a ball for Obama and Obama signing The Audacity of Hope, the book for Willie. And anyway, so it goes into great detail on things that obviously couldn't have been written, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. But now Willie is in his late 80s and is able to reminisce. And he remembers this stuff like it was yesterday, by the way.
I find that ball players have amazing recall. Ted Williams, could recall things that happened 50 years prior. It's amazing to do that kind of brain work to see why that is. Speaking of chapters, is there any one that stands out as a favorite or maybe even difficult to work on?
Well, maybe a favorite would be his chapter with his father and the chapter with Hank. The chapter with his father was probably the first one we did. It was almost like the most comfortable for Willie to talk about, because his dad, Willie Howard Mays Sr., meant so much to him. Willie was born, their parents very young. They didn't stay together. But, his dad, who played ball himself in the Mills, in the Negro Leagues, he was a center fielder, but smaller than what Willie became, quick bunter, leadoff type, base stealer. But he taught Willie about life and baseball, and didn't force it, didn't push it, introduced it, but didn't make it, the end all. And maybe for that reason, Willie never stopped loving it. You compare that to the Mickey Mantle story, where his dad really did push it on him, kind of did force it. But anyway, for Willie, it just came naturally. And he was always better than anybody his age. I mean, in high school, he was playing in the Negro Leagues, for goodness sakes, as a 17, 18, and 19-year-old in Birmingham for the Black Barons, with men who were in their mid-20s, early 30s, and who probably should have been or could have been in the big leagues themselves, but because of the color of their skin, they were playing in the Negro Leagues. And young Willie was their center fielder. And on that 1948 Black Baron team, they went all the way to the Negro League World Series, and that was the final Negro League World Series. So it's just amazing sitting down with Willie and talking about all this stuff in his life and his career in American history. He and Hank Aaron are the only, surviving Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame. And I mentioned the other favorite chapter was Hank Aaron. That could have been in a book in itself. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Hank and, of course, Willie, speaking about themselves all these years later, when people talked about their relationship as a rivalry, or they wanted to outdo each other. And so I dug deep into that and spoke with Felipe Alou, who was a teammate for 6 years with Mays, 6 years with Aaron, Dusty Baker, who was on deck when Hank hit the home run to pass Babe, but also knew Willie from their years in San Francisco. Joe Torre, who grew up idolizing Mays, played with Aaron. Joe Morgan, who's friends with both, McCovey, who grew up in Mobile, Hankstown, but was Willie's teammate and took number 44 after Hank. All these people I spoke with talked about Hank and Willie and the relationship, and it was just fascinating to hear from those two individuals, but everybody else who knew him the best, and to come to conclusions that the chapter did. It's pretty amazing stuff, and I feel honored to be the guy who put the ball on the tee for these fine men.
When working with Willie, were you pretty much in sync on everything, or was there something along the way that you disagreed about the presentation?
I don't think so. Like, he didn't tell me anything not to write. There's an amazing trust, and when I came over to his house, it was, what do you want to talk about now, John? It wasn't like I even had to prepare him. Okay, next Sunday I'll be there at 2 and we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. He was just open to anything, and he really appreciated how it came out. You know, the fact that it's all new information and not recycled stuff that you might have seen in other books, which were taken from other books, which were taken from other books. And I think that's the glory of it. He loves the audiobook as well. Bob Costas not only wrote the foreword, but read the foreword, and I'm getting chills when I hear that. It's just amazing. I didn't know he was such a terrific writer to go along with being a terrific broadcaster. And then there's two narrators. One does Willie's voice and one does everything else. And then at the end, Willie and I do about a 15-minute Q&A in which we talk about the book and other things that just come up in any conversation that we have. And that's the beauty of talking with Willie. You never know where we're going to go with it. And
That's very cool about the audio book. I have always been under the, I don't know if impression is the right word, that if possible, whenever possible, the author should read his or her own work, because no one knows better than the author what it sounds like in their head. Were you were satisfied with the way the audiobook came out?
they asked me if I wanted to, and I said no right away.
Mhm.
But I will tell you that, you know, the person who reads Willie's words, for instance, grew up in Harlem. He's a kid at 30. He's got a Willie Mays tattoo on his arm.
Wow.
He's a big Willie Mays fan at 30. Who is he? He's Julian McWilliams, who covers the Boston Red Sox for the Boston Globe. And I know him well, and I asked him to audition, not knowing, I mean, he's never done anything like that, but here's a kid who grew up in Harlem and played ball, you know, in the shadow of the site of the Polo Grounds, and knows Willie's history is better than any 30-year-old, and has a great voice for the purpose. And nobody's going to sound like Willie. You don't want him to sound like Willie. You just want to kind of capture his soul and his vibe. And then we have kind of a pro who does the other, you know, most of the narrating, everything but Willie's voice. So it's a real neat tandem. And I was allowed to listen in by way of Skype and chime in and say, you know, Hank didn't say those words this way. This is how he emphasized this sentence. And Willie didn't say it this way. So I was in the room and I talked to these 200 people. I talked to Willie for 100 plus hours, and I transcribed every word myself. You know, a lot of guys will send it out, you know, and then have it transcribed and then go from there. I wanted to capture the vibe in the moment and re-listen to every interview and put little marks on items that I thought, yeah, this is cool. This is really good. Or we got to use this, man. And from there, we just built it into a whole book. And I was very lucky and fortunate to be part of the audiobook process, because I was able to hear every word. And every night they went over a segment of the book. I spent the rest of the night listening and going over the details. And then they redid some parts so that it would be the perfect emphasis for that particular. So yeah, I was glad I didn't do it. I thought these guys were fabulous.
You have your copy behind you. I have my copy over here. It has to be a little disappointing in the current situation for you, and I don't know how much Willie would be involved in this. One of the great joys for any author, well, I won't say any author, but most authors probably, is going on the road, doing book tours, talking to people other than as we are here. So that's got to be a little disappointing for you.
Yeah, you're right. And there were some shows set up, and shoot, I was looking forward to going in my local library,
Hmm.
local books, and just seeing. I said, "Whoa, is that it?" You know, getting the chills, take a picture. um, but yeah, that's unfortunate. On the other hand, it seems a lot of people are reading and buying books online. They can actually go to their local um, bookstore. There's an independent link, bookshop.org, that they can order books from, and not just any book, and in the shop hand deliver it, or it could be purchased online and delivered to your house. So I think people are opening up to a new world of reading these days, in lieu of other things they would have been doing. So that's cool, and it's a different venue, different way of doing things, and we're in a time that's really unfortunate, obviously, and it's a time that Willie would like to be at the ballpark but can't.
Hmm.
So I guess next best thing is to read about him or listen to the audiobook about him. So that's yeah. I don't have regrets that maybe when things open up we can get back to that, but it's all relative. You just kind of adjust, like Willie did his whole life, to Candlestick Park or the Polo Grounds or to white baseball. So it's that shoot. But I learned from Willie through all this. All the things he went through, all the teachings, and putting these lessons together. I mean, I absorbed all this stuff, and it seems I would hope to be a better person because of it. And maybe that would be true of anyone who could read it as well, because he's such an inspiration to so many people, man.
I actually heard a commercial on my local station today with Mike Francesa, pardon me, doing an advert for the book and saying what a wonderful Father's Day present this will be. Unfortunately, I don't think this will be out before Father's Day, but it's a great present at any time for anyone who's a great fan of baseball. We've been talking with John Shea, who collaborated with Willie on 24 life stories and lessons from the Say Hey Kid. John, thank you very much. Stay safe and congratulations on the book.
Oh, well, my pleasure. This was fun. Thanks. Anytime I can speak about Willie, man, I'm all in. Thanks for the
Okay.
opportunity.
All right. Thank you.